The moving van arrived at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning in October, its diesel engine rumbling through the frost like something alive and indifferent. Martha stood at the kitchen window, her kitchen window, though not for much longer, and watched the two young men climb out, stretch their backs against the gray sky, and light cigarettes before they even looked at the house. They wore matching blue uniforms with a logo she didn't recognize. Some national company, some corporation that had bought out the local movers she'd used when she first moved into this house 42 years ago, back when her hands were smooth and her husband still laughed with his whole chest. She had made coffee at 6:15, the way she always did. The same chipped mug with the bluebird on it, the same single spoonful of sugar, the same slow walk to the front porch to watch the sun come up over the hayfield. But this morning, the hayfield wasn't hers anymore. The auction had been 3 weeks ago. The paperwork had been signed. The farm, all 120 acres of it, the barn her father built in 1948, the silo where she'd hidden from her brothers as a girl, the creek where her husband had proposed, belonged to a development corporation from 2 states away. They planned to build 47 houses on it, split levels with 2-car garages and vinyl siding, and no memory of anything that had come before. The coffee tasted like nothing. She rinsed the mug and set it upside down on a dish towel next to the sink. She wasn't taking the mug. There wasn't room in the 2 suitcases in the single cardboard box her daughter had said she could bring to the apartment in the city. 1 bedroom, shared bathroom down the hall, no pets, no plants, no nails in the walls. Her daughter had meant well, Martha knew that, but the apartment was a storage unit for the living, a place to put a person you didn't know what else to do with. "Mom, you can't stay here," her daughter had said over the phone, her voice tight with the kind of patience that comes from repeating yourself. "You can't manage the land anymore. You can't afford the taxes. You can't—" "I know," Martha had said, and she did know. She knew her knees ached when the weather turned. She knew the combine hadn't run in 2 years. She knew the bank had stopped returning her calls. She knew all of it. Knowing didn't make the moving van sound any less like a funeral bell. The movers knocked at 8:02. She opened the door and stepped aside and watched them walk through her house like it was a warehouse, tagging furniture with stickers, folding her grandmother's quilt without looking at the stitching, stacking her husband's woodworking tools into a cardboard box marked Miski. They were efficient. They were polite. They didn't know that the dining room table had held 63 Thanksgiving dinners. They didn't know that the scratch on the bedroom doorframe was from a wheelchair, back when her husband was learning to navigate the house after the stroke. They didn't know anything. And why would they? The world had stopped asking for stories a long time ago. By 11:30, the house was empty except for the things she wasn't taking: a broken lamp, a stack of National Geographics from the 1980s, a coffee can full of bent nails, a birdhouse her son had made in Cub Scouts, the roof long since fallen off. She stood in the living room and listened to the silence, and the silence was different from any silence she'd known before. It wasn't the quiet of a sleeping house, or the hush of snowfall, or the peaceful stillness of early morning before the rooster called. It was the silence of a body that had stopped breathing. The house was a shell now, a husk. She picked up her suitcases, one in each hand, the leather straps biting into her palms, and walked out the front door without looking back. The county auction had been held in the old fairgrounds building, the one with the leaky roof and the smell of hay and diesel fuel baked into the concrete floor. Martha had gone because she didn't know what else to do with herself on a Thursday afternoon. The farm was already sold. The apartment was already waiting. She had 6 weeks before she needed to be there, and 6 weeks is both an eternity and no time at all when you're 60 years old and have nowhere to go. She parked her truck, a 1997 Ford F-150, rusted wheel wells, a cracked windshield, engine that knocked when it was cold, in the gravel lot and walked inside with her hands in the pockets of her coat. The auctioneer was already calling out numbers, his voice a rhythmic chant that reminded her of church hymns, the same cadence, the same hypnotic rise and fall. She stood in the back and watched people bid on things nobody wanted. A broken tractor tire went for $2, a pallet of warped plywood went for $7, a box of mismatched hand tools, rusted beyond use, went for 50 cents. Then the auctioneer pointed to the far corner of the building, where a large map had been tacked to the wall, showing parcels of land and easements and something else. A thin line, a railroad spur, marked in faded blue ink. Item 42, the auctioneer said. Abandoned railway equipment, one wooden freight car circa 1920s, located on the old spur line behind the timber yard. County owns the land, but the car itself is being sold as is. No title, no warranty, no guarantee it won't fall apart if you look at it wrong. Do I have $5? Silence. $5, the auctioneer said again. Somebody give me $5 for a piece of history. Martha didn't know why she raised her hand. She didn't know why her arm lifted, why her fingers straightened, why she cleared her throat and said, "I'll take it," in a voice that sounded like someone else's. Maybe it was because the number was small. Maybe it was because she had exactly $5.37 in her purse, and the idea of spending the last of her cash on something utterly useless felt like the only honest thing she'd done in months. Maybe it was because she wanted to own something again, even if that something was a rotting wooden box on a dead railroad track. The auctioneer looked at her. The crowd looked at her. A man near the front laughed, a short, sharp sound like a dog's bark, and someone else muttered something she didn't catch. But the auctioneer just shrugged and banged his gavel and said, "Sold, $5. Come see me after, ma'am." She walked out of the fairgrounds with a receipt in her hand and a feeling in her chest that she couldn't name. It wasn't hope exactly. It was too quiet for hope. It was too uncertain. It was more like a question she hadn't finished asking, a sentence she hadn't completed, a door she hadn't decided whether to open. The timber yard had closed in 1987. Martha remembered driving past it as a young woman, remembered the smell of fresh-cut pine and the sound of saws biting into wood, remembered the men who stood by the road with hard hats and cigarettes and faces weathered by decades of the same work. Now the yard was a graveyard of rusted equipment and collapsed sheds and weeds that had grown tall enough to hide a deer. The road that led to it was unpaved, full of potholes and broken asphalt, and her truck bounced and shuddered as she followed the tracks toward the spur line. She saw the railcar before she saw anything else. It sat at the end of the spur, maybe 200 feet from where the tracks disappeared into a thicket of blackberry brambles and wild sumac. The car was long, maybe 40 feet, maybe 50, with a rounded roof and wooden sides that had once been painted boxcar red but had faded to the color of dried blood. The word Pullman was still visible near one end, the letters ghostly and worn, like a headstone too old to read. The wheels were sunk into the earth up to their axles, and grass and weeds grew up around them, claiming the metal back for the soil. One of the doors hung open at an angle, its track long since rusted solid. The other door was missing entirely, leaving a dark rectangle that reminded Martha of a mouth missing its teeth. She got out of the truck and walked toward it slowly, her boots crunching on gravel and dead leaves. The air smelled of rot and wet wood, and something else, something metallic, something old, something that reminded her of the barn on her father's farm, the way it smelled after a rain, when the hay was damp and the air was thick with the ghosts of animals that had lived and died in its stalls. The railcar was worse than she'd expected, and better. Up close, she could see the craftsmanship, the way the wood had been joined, the brass fittings still holding after a century, the iron bolts that had been hammered in by hand. The roof had holes in it, yes. The floor was soft in places. The interior, when she climbed inside, was dark and cold and smelled of mice and mold and time. But the walls were thick. The frame was solid, and there was something about the space, the narrowness of it, the shelter of it, the way the light fell through the missing door in a single long rectangle onto the wooden floor, that made her think of cathedrals. She sat down on the floor, right there in the dust and the dirt and the mouse droppings, and she put her head in her hands. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry, too hollowed out, too far past the border where tears made any difference. But she sat there for a long time, and the afternoon light shifted around her, and the wind blew through the holes in the roof. And somewhere outside, a bird called out 3 notes and then fell silent. The apartment in the city had a bedroom the size of a closet, and a window that faced a brick wall, and a heating system that clicked and groaned all night like something in pain. Her daughter had driven her there on a Sunday, had helped her carry the suitcases up 3 flights of stairs, had stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her mouth pressed into a thin line and said, "You'll be okay here, Mom. Give it time." Martha had nodded. She had unpacked the suitcases. She had put her clothes in the dresser and her toothbrush in the bathroom and her husband's photograph on the nightstand. She had sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the city sounds, sirens, traffic, someone yelling in a language she didn't recognize, and she had felt, for the first time in her life, like she had disappeared. Not died. Disappeared. Like she had become invisible, not to the world but to herself, like the person she had been, the farmer's daughter, the young bride, the mother, the widow, the woman who could fix a tractor and bake a pie and deliver a calf in the middle of a snowstorm, had been a story someone else had told, and now the story was over, and she was just a body waiting for whatever came next. She lasted 3 weeks. On a Thursday morning, she packed her suitcases again, left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I'm sorry, I can't stay," and drove back to the county where she'd spent her whole life. She didn't call her daughter. She didn't know what she would say. She just drove, and the truck ate up the miles, and by the time the sun was setting, she was parked next to the abandoned railcar again, staring at its dark mouth, listening to the wind. She had no plan. She had no money, less than $40, plus whatever change she could find in the truck's ashtray. She had no electricity, no running water, no bathroom, no bed. She had a half-tank of gas, 2 suitcases of clothes, a cardboard box of photographs and books and her husband's old flannel shirt, and a $5 railcar that nobody else wanted. She also had something she hadn't felt in months. She had the beginning of an idea. The first night was cold. Colder than she'd expected, the October air dropping into the 30s, the wind finding every crack and crevice in the railcar's walls. She slept in her coat, her boots still on, wrapped in a wool blanket she'd kept from the farm. She didn't sleep well. She slept in fragments, waking every hour to the sound of branches scraping the roof, or animals moving through the weeds, or the railcar settling on its wheels, groaning like an old man shifting in his sleep. But when the sun came up, pink and gold through the missing door, she woke to the sound of birds and the smell of frost melting, and the sight of her breath hanging in the air like something almost solid. She sat up slowly, her back aching, her fingers stiff, and she looked around the railcar's interior and saw not a wreck, but a room. It was 40 feet long and maybe 10 feet wide. The ceiling arched overhead, the wooden ribs exposed where the interior paneling had fallen away. The floor was rough-hewn planks, dark with age, worn smooth in some places by decades of footsteps and rough in others where the wood had splintered and warped. There were iron rings bolted to the walls, anchors for cargo straps, she realized, and a long metal rod that ran the length of the ceiling, the mechanism for the sliding doors. Near one end, a brake wheel stood like a ship's helm, its spokes crusted with rust but still solid, still connected to something beneath the floor. She stood up and walked the length of the car, her footsteps echoing on the wood. She ran her hands along the walls, feeling the grain, the texture, the places where the wood had been repaired or replaced over the years. And that was when she noticed it. The walls were too thick. She stopped at a spot where the interior paneling had cracked, revealing a gap behind it. She pushed her fingers into the gap and felt empty space, not just insulation or air, but a cavity deep enough to hide something. She pulled her hand back and looked at the wall differently, no longer seeing a surface, but a question. Why would a freight car have double walls? What was between them? She didn't have tools. She had a Swiss Army knife on her keychain and a tire iron in the truck and a pair of scissors in her suitcase. She spent the morning with the scissors, working the blade into the cracks between the boards, prying and pulling and cursing under her breath. By noon, she'd removed 3 long planks from one section of the wall, revealing the space behind it, a gap of about 4 inches, lined with what looked like old newsprint and burlap. And in that gap, tucked between the inner wall and the outer wall, she found a leather satchel. It was small, no bigger than a paperback book, brown with age, the stitching frayed but still holding. She pulled it out carefully, afraid it would fall apart in her hands, and held it up to the light. The leather was dry but intact. There was no writing on it, no marking, nothing to indicate what it contained or who had put it there. She worked the buckle open, rusty, stiff, but it gave after a moment, and lifted the flap. Inside were letters, dozens of them, folded into tight squares, tied with red ribbon that had faded to pink. She pulled one out and unfolded it carefully, the paper crackling like dry leaves. The handwriting was elegant, looping, the ink faded to brown. She squinted at the first line. "Dear Samuel, I'm writing this in the dark so the children won't see me cry." She read the whole letter standing there in the rail car, the light shifting through the missing door, her breath fogging in the cold air. It was a love letter, or something like one. A letter from a woman to her husband, written in 1943, full of longing and fear, and the small details of a life being held together by will alone. The children were sick. The roof was leaking. The woman didn't know if her husband was alive or dead, if he was coming home, if the war would ever end. She had written the letter and then, for reasons Martha couldn't guess, had never mailed it. There were more letters in the satchel. She pulled them out one by one, not reading them all, just looking at the dates, the names, the addresses, 1944, 1945, 1946, letters from wives to husbands, letters from mothers to sons, letters from brothers to sisters, from fathers to daughters, from friends to friends who had moved away and lost touch. They were all unmailed, all hidden, all waiting. She sat down on the floor with the letters spread around her like fallen leaves, and she felt something shift in her chest, something she hadn't felt since her husband died, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel because it hurt too much. She felt connected, not to the letters themselves, not to the people who had written them, but to the act of writing, to the act of reaching across distance and time and saying, I was here. I mattered. I loved someone. These letters were proof that ordinary lives were not ordinary at all, that every person who had ever lived had carried inside them a story worth telling, that the world was full of unmailed words, unspoken feelings, undelivered truths, and she had found them. She spent the next 3 days pulling the railcar apart, not destroying it. She was too careful for that, too respectful of the craftsmanship, too aware that she was handling something precious. But she removed the remaining interior paneling board by board, stacking the wood outside in neat piles, sorting the planks by size and condition. Behind the paneling, in the 4-inch gap between the inner and outer walls, she found more satchels, dozens of them, some leather, some canvas, some wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. She pulled them all out, carrying them into the sunlight, opening each one with hands that trembled from cold and exhaustion and something that felt like reverence. By the end of the 3rd day, she had 347 letters. Some were bundled by year, some by family, some by address. They spanned from 1928 to 1965, the period when the railcar had been used as a mobile post office. She pieced this together from a letter she found tucked inside one of the satchels, a note from a railway postal clerk explaining that the car had been converted in 1927 to handle mail for the county's rural routes. The car had traveled the spur line twice a week, picking up outgoing mail and dropping off incoming, serving as a lifeline for farms and towns too remote for daily delivery. But in 1965, something had happened. The rail car had been taken out of service, shunted onto this spur, and forgotten. And the letters, hundreds of them, thousands of them, the unsent and the undelivered, had been left inside the walls, hidden in the gap where no one would think to look. Why? Martha didn't know. Maybe the postal clerk had been overwhelmed. Maybe he'd been hiding them for reasons she couldn't guess. Maybe the letters had been placed there deliberately, a time capsule of ordinary longing, waiting for someone to find them. She sat on the floor of the rail car as the sun went down on the 3rd day, surrounded by 347 stories, and she realized she wasn't living in a wreck anymore. She was living in a library. The first letter she decided to deliver was the one that had made her cry. She'd found it on the 2nd day, tucked inside a canvas satchel marked with a name she didn't recognize, for the family of Thomas Ashworth. Thomas Ashworth had been a farmer, according to the return address on the envelope. He'd written the letter in 1952, 10 years after his son had left home following a fight about money and pride, and the way fathers and sons have always fought about things that don't matter until they matter too much. My dear boy, the letter began. I'm writing this on your mother's birthday. She still sets a place for you at the table. She still asks if I've heard from you. I lie and say yes, that you're doing fine, that you'll write when you can. I don't know why I lie. Maybe because the truth, that I drove you away with my stubbornness, my pride, my inability to say I was wrong, is too heavy to carry alone. I was wrong. I was wrong about the farm. I was wrong about the money. I was wrong about you. You were never lazy. You were never foolish. You were young, and I was afraid, and I took my fear out on you because I didn't know what else to do with it. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. Your mother is dying. I don't know how to tell you this except to write it down and hope these words reach you somehow. The doctor says she has maybe 6 months. She doesn't know. I haven't told her, but she must suspect. She's been writing letters of her own, tucking them into her dresser drawer, letters she won't let me read. Maybe she's writing to you. I hope she is. I hope you get to read them someday. I'm sending this letter to the address your sister gave me, the one in the city. I don't know if you still live there. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I needed to write it. I needed to say I'm sorry. I needed you to know that your mother loves you, that I love you, that the door is open, and it has been open every single day since you left, and it will stay open until I die. Your father. Martha had read the letter 3 times, and each time she'd cried harder. Not because the writing was beautiful. It wasn't. Not in any literary sense. The grammar was clumsy. The sentences ran on. The punctuation was almost non-existent. But the feeling behind the words was so raw, so unguarded, so real that it felt like a wound pressed to her chest. She looked up the name Thomas Ashworth in the county records. There was a library in the next town over, a small brick building with a hitching post still standing outside, and the librarian was a woman named Carol, who didn't ask questions when Martha walked in smelling like dust and wood smoke and 3 days without a shower. Carol just smiled and pointed her toward the microfilm reader and brought her a cup of coffee in a ceramic mug shaped like a cat. The records showed that Thomas Ashworth had died in 1961, 9 years after writing the letter. His wife, Eleanor, had died in 1953, just as he'd predicted. Their son, Robert Ashworth, was still alive. He lived 20 miles away, in a retirement community called Golden Valley Gardens. He was 87 years old. Martha drove to Golden Valley Gardens the next morning. She'd cleaned up as best she could, washed her face in the railcar with bottled water, brushed her hair, put on her cleanest shirt. She still looked like someone who'd been sleeping in a train car, but there was nothing she could do about that. She parked the truck in the visitor's lot and walked up the concrete path to the front door, the letter folded carefully in her coat pocket. The woman at the front desk was named Denise. She had bleached blonde hair and pink reading glasses on a chain and the kind of professional cheerfulness that Martha recognized as a defense mechanism. "Can I help you, hon?" "I'm here to see Robert Ashworth." "No appointment?" "No." Denise's smile flickered. "He doesn't get many visitors. Most days he just sits in the common room and watches the birds at the feeder. He doesn't talk much. The staff says he's been quiet since he arrived, like he's waiting for something." Martha nodded. "I have a letter for him. A letter his father wrote a long time ago." Denise looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way people look when they're trying to decide whether someone is dangerous or simply strange. Then she shrugged and pointed down the hallway. "Room 117. He's probably in the common room, though. Left at the end of the hall, can't miss it." The common room smelled like coffee and floor wax and the particular sweetness of air freshener trying too hard. There were maybe a dozen residents scattered around, some in wheelchairs, some in armchairs, some asleep with their mouths open and their hands resting on their stomachs. In the corner, by a window that faced a bird feeder full of sparrows, sat an old man in a blue cardigan. Martha walked toward him slowly, her boots quiet on the linoleum. He didn't look up when she approached. He just kept watching the birds, his hands folded in his lap, his face a map of wrinkles and sunspots and the kind of stillness that comes from decades of holding things in. "Mr. Ashworth?" she said. He turned his head slowly, like a man who had learned not to expect anything from the world. His eyes were pale blue, watery with age, but there was something sharp behind them, something that hadn't dulled even after all these years. "I'm sorry to bother you," Martha said. "My name is Martha. I found something that belongs to you." She pulled the letter from her pocket and held it out. He looked at it but didn't reach for it. His hands remained folded in his lap. "What is it?" he asked. His voice was thin, reedy but clear. "It's a letter from your father, Thomas Ashworth. He wrote it in 1952. The old man's face didn't change. His hands didn't move. But something happened in his eyes, something that looked like a door opening onto a room he'd kept locked for a very long time. "My father's been dead for 62 years, he said. "I know. How do you have a letter from a dead man?" Martha sat down in the chair next to him. The springs creaked under her weight. She folded her hands in her lap and told him about the rail car, about the walls, about the 347 letters. She told him about finding his father's letter tucked inside a satchel, hidden between the wood, waiting. She told him about the words she'd read, the apology, the confession, the door that had stayed open every single day. She didn't tell him that his mother had died 6 months after the letter was written. She figured he already knew. Robert Ashworth reached out and took the letter from her hand. His fingers trembled as he unfolded it, as he held it up to the light, as he began to read. And as he read, his face crumbled. Not dramatically, not with sobs or tears or any of the things movies show you, but quietly, internally, the way a building collapses when the supports have been rusting for decades. He finished the letter and folded it carefully along its original creases. He held it against his chest, pressing it to his heart like a wounded man pressing a bandage to a wound. "He came to see me," Robert said, "in 1953, after my mother died. He came to the city, found my apartment, knocked on the door. I didn't answer. I watched him through the peephole. He stood there for almost an hour. He knocked 3 times. And I just stood there. I didn't open the door." Martha said nothing. "I told myself I was punishing him, that he deserved it, that he'd driven me away, and he could live with the consequences. But I was punishing myself too. I was punishing myself every single day, and I didn't even know it." He looked down at the letter in his hands. He apologized. He actually apologized, and I never knew. "You know now," Martha said. The old man looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, he smiled. It was a small smile, fragile, the kind of smile that could be erased by a harsh word or a cold look. But it was there. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for bringing this to me." Martha nodded and stood up. She walked out of the common room, past the bird feeder and the sleeping residents and Denise at the front desk, and she drove back to the rail car, with tears running down her face and a feeling in her chest that she finally recognized. Purpose. She was not a widow in a train car. She was a postman. Word spread slowly at first, the way word always spreads in a small town, through the diner, through the post office, through the pews of the Methodist church on Sunday mornings. Someone knew someone whose cousin had gotten a letter from a woman living in an old rail car. Someone else had seen Martha walking down Main Street with a satchel over her shoulder, knocking on doors, handing out envelopes that smelled like dust and thyme. By the second week, she'd delivered 47 letters. She worked methodically, alphabetically, starting with the oldest letters and moving forward. Each letter required research, checking property records, obituaries, phone books, the memories of old-timers who still remembered the names of families that had moved away decades ago. Some addresses no longer existed. Some families had died out or scattered to other states, but most of the letters, surprisingly, most of them still had someone to receive them. A grandchild, a niece, a great-nephew who'd inherited the family farm and didn't know that his great-grandmother had written a letter of apology to a neighbor she'd wronged in 1941. The responses varied. Some people cried. Some people sat in silence for a long time, holding the letter like a holy relic. Some people laughed, not from cruelty but from the shock of it, the absurdity of receiving a message from the dead. One woman, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, read a letter from her mother, written in 1948, the year Margaret had left home to go to college, and then looked up at Martha with eyes that were dry and fierce and said, "My mother never told me she was proud of me, not once, not in 40 years, and here it is, in her own handwriting. I'm so proud of you." She wrote it. She just never mailed it. Martha didn't know what to say to that. She just stood there in the doorway of Margaret's house, the wind blowing through the screen door, the smell of wood smoke and old books drifting past her. "She was afraid," Martha said finally. "Your mother. She was probably afraid that if she said it out loud, if she put it in writing, something bad would happen. People are like that. They think love is a jinx. They think if they name it, they'll lose it." Margaret nodded slowly. "She lost me anyway. I moved to California. I didn't come back for 20 years. By then, she was gone." "But you know now," Martha said. And she realized she'd said those same words before, to Robert Ashworth in the retirement home, and that they were becoming something like a prayer, something like a mission statement. You know now, you know now, you know now. Margaret folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan. What do I owe you? Nothing, Martha said. It's already been paid for. She walked back to her truck and drove to the next address on her list, and the next, and by the time the sun went down, she had delivered 15 more letters, and her feet were sore, and her throat was raw from talking, and she had never felt more alive in her entire life. The railcar was changing. It had started as a wreck, a shell, a place to sleep out of the wind. But as the days passed and the deliveries continued, Martha began to transform it into something else. She patched the roof with tarpaulin and scrap lumber. She built a bed frame from pallets she found behind the hardware store. She scavenged a wood stove from a junk dealer, cast iron, rusty but intact, small enough to fit in the corner of the railcar without taking up too much space. She spent a week cleaning the stove, replacing the gaskets, learning how to light a fire without filling the car with smoke. The first night the stove burned, she sat on her bed, a mattress she'd found at a thrift store, still in decent shape, no stains she couldn't ignore, and watched the flames through the small glass window in the stove's door. The heat radiated outward, warming the wooden walls, chasing away the damp. Outside, the wind was bitter, the temperature dropping into the 20s, but inside the rail car, Martha was warm. She had electricity now, too, a small solar panel she'd bought with the last of her money, attached to a deep-cycle battery she'd found at a garage sale. It wasn't much. It powered a single LED bulb and charged her phone. But it was enough. Enough to read by. Enough to keep her from feeling like she'd stepped back 100 years. The letters were stacked in wooden crates along one wall, organized by decade, by family name, by the order in which she planned to deliver them. She had a notebook now, spiral-bound, the cover smudged with dirt and coffee stains, where she recorded each delivery, each response, each small piece of healing she witnessed. The notebook was becoming a record not just of the letters, but of the town itself, of the way a community could be knitted back together by words that had waited too long to be spoken. She was sitting on her bed one evening, reviewing the next day's deliveries, when she noticed a satchel she hadn't opened before. It was smaller than the others, made of soft brown leather, tied with a leather cord instead of ribbon. There was no label on it, no marking, nothing to indicate its contents. She'd overlooked it somehow, tucked it into the wrong crate, forgotten about it until now. She pulled the cord loose and reached inside. There were only 3 letters in this satchel. The first was addressed to a woman named Eliza Hemlock, Martha didn't recognize the name, at an address on the Old County Road. The second was addressed to a man named Arthur Hemlock at the same address. The third was addressed to Martha's mother. Martha stared at the third letter for a long time. Her mother had died in 1989. She'd been 72 years old, worn out by a life of farming and child-rearing and the quiet grief of losing her husband to a war that had never really ended. Martha had been 37 when her mother passed, old enough to think she understood her, young enough to